Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this last session in this series of talks that have been organized by the UAC's Graduate Forum. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Carlos Bravo. I'm a PhD student at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. I'm also affiliated to the Barcelona Institute of International Studies, IBE. And my research is about crisis, management of crisis in the European Union, crises that appear outside of the European Union. I'm also an events officer at the UAC's Graduate Forum, and I will be chairing somehow and discussing the paper. Chairing this session and discussing the papers of Alina and Marianna. We have on the one hand Alina Felder, who will start by presenting her paper on the development of cross-border cooperation initiatives in the field of higher education, right, and how Europeanization has influenced this process. She's a PhD student at the University of Bamberg, right? And as you say, we met last year, so I'm really happy that you're here and I'm discussing here your paper. I'm really happy to have Marianna Lovato, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, if anything I say is wrong, of course, at any point in the session, including these introductions. She's a PhD student at the University College Dublin, right? And she's gonna present her research on the role of Italy in the negotiations with the European Union, in different negotiations, right? And how different factors have shaped its likelihood of being successful, right? Just one final note, please. I would like to ask you to refrain from sharing any of the papers that will be presented here, or uploading them to any website, just without, of course, the permission of the authors, right? And I think that's all from me. I don't think I'm missing anything, so I will just give the floor to Alina, right? The floor is yours, yes.
Thank you so much. I will be sharing my screen. I prepared some slides, so I hope that everyone can see my presentation now. So thank you again for having me, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to get some feedback from people who are actually researching the European Union, which at my graduate school is not the case very often. So I'm looking forward to your comments. As Carlos has announced, my research is on the cross-border cooperation among higher education institutions and what Europeanization processes have to do with this. The paper I'm presenting was submitted to a special issue of a journal, and I already received it back. So the version I circulated among yourselves is already a revised version, but I'm still revising it, so any comments are really welcome. I would like to start with very briefly outlining the broader research agenda, which is the research agenda of my dissertation. So at some point I found that institutions of higher education are not only addressed by genuine higher education policies such as the Bologna process and funding instruments like Erasmus+, but also by instruments of EU regional policy. So I started to look at, well, firstly, education policies, where you can find that mobility and networking are the go-to formats, how higher education institutions cooperate, and so to say also the cornerstone of EU higher education policy. On the other hand, you have regional policy, which has lived several reforms and ever more turned to overarching strategies of the European Union, which we all know, so Lisbon strategy and also Europe 2020. And their knowledge is also very important. There's always the argument that knowledge is very important to increase the competitiveness of the European Union. And at this intersection, my bigger overarching research question is how regional policy, as a very traditional and also strong EU policy, fosters EU higher education policy. And in the paper we are discussing today, the research question is more specific to make it operational, obviously. So the question of the paper is, to what extent does EU regional policy matter in the cross-border cooperation among higher education institutions? The theoretical, or rather conceptual approach, because with Europeanization approaches, it's always a bit difficult to argue that they are indeed a theory. So to be more careful, maybe say conceptual approach, you can have a look from two perspectives, so from top-down Europeanization and from bottom-up Europeanization. If you look at this question from the top to the bottom, the question is, have EU regional policy programs altered constellations of domestic actors and hence favored cooperation that would not have emerged? And then vice versa, the question is, how do higher education institutions operating across borders try to shape the programs that are participating? So moving from this beneficiary perspective, where higher education institutions benefit from EU policy, towards a more actor-centered perspective, where they come in as policy developers, so to say. I've developed, or I try to combine these two perspectives by operationalizing three different lines of assumption, so to say, while I split this indirect funded cooperation among higher education institutions in three phases, so to say. First of all, I look at the conditions, so how they emerged, and I look at how they are designed, and finally what their outcome is. And ultimately, but this is not the scope of this paper, also what the impact then is on EU higher education policy. So when it comes to the conditions, the question is, when do higher education institutions opt for Interreg? Then obviously for the design, the question is, how is Interreg funded cross-border cooperation designed? And then finally, what is the result? So from a top-down Europeanization perspective, you first have the perspective of institutional compliance. Well, you can just have a look, and I assume that most of you also read it, so just, I don't want to make this too lengthy now, but it's just that Interreg funded cooperation, cross-border cooperation is opted for if only moderate changes are necessary. Then in the design, the existing structures are adapted, and this in the outcome leads to reinforced institutional adaptation, so to say, in a path-dependent logic. When it comes to the second top-down Europeanization perspective, you would look at how beliefs are shaped, and Interreg is opted for if the beliefs that are presented in the programs can be accommodated within the beliefs that are present in the context. And then such projects are shaped along the strategic planning of the European Union, so they would refer to frames like knowledge society or something like that, and this in turn, as the outcome, reinforces ideational adaptation even more, so that in the long run there's really a cross-border region identity. So if you look at this from the bottom to the top, the conditions to have Interreg funded cross-border cooperation is really that in the beginning there's more like a contest, but that there's also evenly distributed resources among the actors. In the design, this adaptation I outlined before would only take place to secure political and financial resources, but obviously this has unintended consequences. And it also, in the outcome, leads to the fact that regional actors attempt to influence the policies they're benefiting from. So these are my assumptions, and well, how I did this was by looking into two specific cases of cross-border cooperation among higher education institutions. So I had a look at a smaller cooperation framework, which is in the greater region, so in Belgium, Germany, France, and Luxembourg. And this network was essentially established only because of EU regional policy. And then I had to look at another network that was already established prior to receiving EU regional policy funding. It's also a bigger network, and I decided to opt for these different networks to see how the processes I outlined before unfold differently. What unites the two cases is that they have been receiving funding in 2 subsequent periods. So in Interreg 4, which was from 2007 to 2013, and then in the past Interreg period, so 2014 to 2020. And this helped me to trace the development over a longer period of time. Concerning the findings, I will only present 2 findings here to not make it too lengthy. I will present you how cross-border cooperation looks like, and then also what the frameworks the EU is giving through the funding, but also through ideas that are around affects the objectives of cross-border cooperation. When it comes to the implementation designs, what I found, the patterns I found is that at the center of the governance obviously are the higher education institutions, and they organize themselves within a council. Sometimes there's like differentiation between rectors and vice rectors, but anyway, they are really the ones deciding to cooperate, and they also implement strategic decisions. They are supported by facilitating actors, which are in most of the cases located at the universities themselves or within an office. And as for the case of the Greater Region Network, they even have decentral officers at each participating university. For the International University of the Lake Constance area, this is not feasible because it's a lot more universities participating. So yeah, what I would like to outline here before I go to the next finding is that it's really, it was interesting to see how the political actors' role is different. So for the case of the Greater Region Network, it's less pivotal because they really are institutionalized. They have they have a form, and they are really a personality. And then for the other network, they are more dependent on political actors because they are still informal, and they have a lot more contact with the politicians of the region. And when I looked at how regulative and also imaginary frameworks play a role, I divided the actors again into these groups. I left out the administrative actors because very often they align with the higher education institution board members. So you can find academic, economic, political, financial, and then also social and cultural drivers and objectives. So when it comes to higher education institutions, they cooperate because of academic reasons, because they want to increase mobility, there are common interests, but there's also economic drivers. They want to provide labor force for the region. With the political actors, these 2 drivers and objectives were really entangled, so you could not really separate those. So there was always the connection between research and innovation, which then would lead to competitiveness again. And then, notions like skills development to prevent brain drain. The 2 actor groups also have political objectives. So for higher education institutions, it's internationalization. And then for the political actors, it was really what I found when I interviewed them was really that they want to increase national attention towards the periphery, because border regions are always at the periphery of all the involved states. And they always try to emphasize how this region is a role model for innovation policies and stuff like this. There were also financial objectives. So since there's not a lot of funding for this kind of cooperation at the national level, they refrain to EU funding. So they try to get access to EU funding, and then through that fund activities, so research activities or mobilities among the students through this funding. And finally, there were also more social or cultural objectives. So for the universities, it was to be a genuine European university, and there's also been this recent initiative by the Erasmus Plus program, the European Universities Initiative, after a speech by Macron. And yeah, so the two networks where I interviewed actors from these three groups really were disappointed that they were not considered, because they really feel as European universities. And then for the political actors, social or cultural objectives were not so important. And this leads me to the conclusions already. What I could really see is that these drivers, I mean, this has obviously also already been researched in internationalization research, but more towards transnational networks of universities. So what I found is that these drivers also apply to cross-border cooperation settings. And I also found what was already reflected in further research, that it's really, that policy really matters and that paradigms are really important. So this ideational component of cross-border cooperation is very much there, which also means that these networks go beyond implementation, governance, and they're really establishing networks where a strong identity feeling is present. Going back to the assumptions I presented earlier, I just summarized them in a table, and you can read this more thoroughly in the paper. So I found evidence for all three patterns of Europeanization. So Europeanization does indeed play a role in these contexts, at least, or for, yeah, when it comes to top-down Europeanization. For the case of bottom-up Europeanization, I did further research in spring, so in March before the lockdown started, to move beyond this context and to triangulate the findings, but I couldn't include those in the paper yet. But nevertheless, I'm planning to triangulate what I found and how people perceive in cross-border contexts, how they perceive their influence, how it actually really unfolds in Brussels, because what they perceive in a border region might be different from actors at EU level. So this is important to scrutinize. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for the attention. And there's also my references. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Alina. Just one small word. I just realized that it's really too hot in my room if I have my door closed. So just let me know if there is a lot of noise or from outside, okay? And I will just close the door and boil myself, okay? But let me know. Okay, thank you very much, Alina, for your presentation. I think I really liked your paper, honestly. I really like how you want to link Europeanization to cross-border cooperation. I don't know to what extent this is an underexplored research area, but if it's the case, it's a really interesting niche that you've found. I mean, I hope that at least some of my comments will be useful, but you know, I'm not an expert on the topic that you're examining. So just I mean, bear that in mind. So if I'm not making sense, just feel free to not take my comments too seriously. Okay. So let's get started. I was having a look at your title, and that confused me a little bit in a way, right? Because you imply that you're doing kind of a case study, right? But to me, it seems that you're doing more of a comparative design, right? You're comparing two different cases. So I was just surprised that you put a case study in your title, and I was wondering, well, why that was the case. By the way, I was thinking of giving all my comments at once, but if you prefer to interrupt me at any point, just do it, okay? Then when I was having a look at your abstract, I see that you kind of repeat your research question twice, and there is not really a lot of variation in the way that you frame it. I mean, since you frame it twice, right? So I understand that maybe one of them could be a bit more specific than the other one, but still, I guess that if you want to keep I mean, this formulation, you might want to differentiate more between the two ways that you present your research question if you really want to do this. Staying with the abstract, I would still write something about the methodology of your study, right? I mean, if it's a comparative design in the sense that you're having a look at two different case study, it wouldn't hurt that you say there, right, which cases you'll be comparing, right? Okay, so now going to the introduction, I see that just a couple of points. I'm not an expert again, right? So maybe that's why I'm giving you these comments. But I think that at some points in the paper you assume that the reader has some knowledge that the reader might not have, right? When you talk, for example, of the principles of additionality, concentration, partnership, and programming, maybe it wouldn't hurt that you gave some context, okay, around this. And in a similar way, maybe you should contextualize a little bit more this idea of interreg, European territorial cooperation, right? Just to make it a bit more friendly to your reader. I mean, that might not be an expert on this area, right? In kind of a similar fashion, there are some small bits that I was struggling to understand, right? For example, I think it's in your introduction, you say, higher education institutions are not only addressed by intergovernmental cooperation frameworks, but also by the European Union regional policy instruments. I was like a bit, I don't know, maybe like you could be a more transparent in the formulation of some bits in your paper. Here I'm giving you a very specific example, but this is something that I've seen in sometimes, right? And then I think in overall also kind of something that I've noticed, more of a general thing, is that especially in the introduction, I think the different sentences in the introduction could be like better connected so that one leads to the next one, right? Sometimes it was kind of hard for me to follow what the argument in the introduction was, right? So then I will just go with the theoretical discussion, right? And this is something that I was wondering, right? I was wondering if there is a difference at all between the discursive institutionalist approach to Europeanization and social constructivist institutionalist approach, right? I mean, they seem quite similar to me, so I don't know if they are exactly the same, right? In the sense that social constructivist institutionalism is like laying emphasis on the internalization of a series of identities, of values and norms, right? Leading the process of Europeanization. And I mean, if they are the same, then there's no comment. But if they are not, and there is a difference, I was wondering why you excluded the latter perspective, right, from your model. I was also wondering to what extent, and this is also out of curiosity, to what extent the categories that you propose in your model could overlap, right? For example, I mean, if I understand that these are maybe ideal categories, right, of that lead to Europeanization, right? But I was wondering maybe that sometimes there are elements from the institutional compliance adaptation, right? For example, the motivation, right, that the actor that primarily drives change is more of a top-down, but then the result is more of I don't know, the result that would be expecting a bottom-up approach, right? For example, even some rent-seeking behavior on the parts of the actors involved, right? I was just wondering if that's the case or not, but this is out of pure curiosity. Also, I was wondering, when you were talking about the Europeanization by institutional compliance, I was wondering if you could like maybe elaborate a bit more on what could lead initially reluctant institutions to adapt, right? If even if required changes are moderate, they are reluctant in a way, right? So you acknowledge that cooperation becoming an established practice could be a driver of cooperation in such situation. But I mean, do they have any other incentives to do so, or could they have? So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it makes sense to elaborate on this, but I mean, as a reader, I was curious. So maybe that's a way to go for you. Then also, when you're talking about the tools that you use to illustrate your analysis, you're citing both the experimentalist governance model, right, and the network governance model. And I was wondering here, because I mean, if I'm not mistaken, and again, correct me if I'm very wrong, in the experimentalist governance model, there is this shadow of hierarchy in a way, right? It's kind of a hybrid between hierarchy and network forms of governance, right? And in the experimentalist governance, there is the shadow of hierarchy that kind of encourages parties to cooperate, right? Because it might be forced to intervene, this more of hierarchical side, right? The hierarchical party, if there is an absence of cooperation, right? So I was wondering, because I didn't see much of this, and even, I mean, you're saying that experimentalist governance and network governance are helping you understand, right? But in a way, these two are related but a bit different. I don't know if it's just that in one of the cases you see more of an experimentalist governance and why it is the case in a way. I mean, maybe there is experimentalist governance even without the shadow of hierarchy, and there again, I have to acknowledge my ignorance on the topic, right? But I mean, I was curious again of this, right? Then a couple of points more. I was wondering, and don't worry, because I will email you my comments, okay, later. So don't panic if I'm like being too fast, right? I was wondering, the title of the final section, right? You're saying conclusions on the role of Europeanization, blah, blah, blah. I was wondering, I mean, this, you could perhaps shorten the title, right? I mean, and even rather than conclusions, you're doing a discussion, right? More about what you found, right? In the case study analysis, right? Maybe, I mean, you want to include a conclusion section afterwards, right? But I mean, where you want to recap with what is important regarding the answer to your research question, right? Rather than maybe adding new information. But I mean, I was wondering whether that could be something that you could do. But again, I think in any case, the title of section 5 could be definitely shortened a little bit. And well, I liked very much also your discussion. I really liked it. I was just maybe missing that sometimes you could illustrate some of your statements with some specific examples, right? That you could have extracted from your case study research, that you could help you, that they could help maybe your reader follow your argument, right? For example, when you're saying that ideational aspects should not be underestimated because projects are designed to mirror EU strategic planning, maybe an example here would help, right, to the reader to visualize where you're arguing, right? And then one final point, you said that you interviewed 35 people, but maybe I'm missing here, I mean, as an annex, a table of interviewees, right? Perhaps in the fashion that Marianna included in her paper, right? In a way that, who are you interviewing each time? I mean, I understand that revealing their names might not be possible if they requested anonymity, right? But from which institution, what's their, I mean, even if you cannot be very specific on their position, but some note that could help your reader know who you've interviewed, right? When did you do the interviews? How did you do them? Did you do it in person, via Skype or telephone calls? And also, I don't know if you've done it, but I had the impression that you did not interview any of EU officials, right, that could be responsible for interreg policies, and I was wondering why. Again, I'm not an expert on this topic, so maybe it does not make sense at all to interview them, but I was just wondering. And those would be my comments. I don't know, I mean, if you want to reply or say something about them before I give the floor to everyone else. So Alina, if you want, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. All of the comments are well taken. Yes, thank you for the abstract. I also received feedback by the 2 reviewers for the paper from the journal, and so many of the things you were saying are overlapping with what they suggest. I drafted the table of interviews yesterday. There was, yeah, a big mistake. Obviously, it shouldn't happen further, and I decided to include 2 further interviews I did in March only. The thing is always that when you're working all on your own on something, then you have to transcribe and analyze. So yeah, I had a bit of time pressure, but yeah, I will include 2 interviews I did in Brussels. So with one person from DG Regio and then with one person from DG AAC. So this will be included in the revised version because obviously otherwise you can't make statements like the ones I did. And yeah, when it comes to the illustration with examples, I already started doing this also yesterday. So there will be references towards the interview. So behind the statements, and I was also planning on quoting 2 or 3 people to make it more illustrative. When it comes to the theoretical discussion, yeah, I think that the point you mentioned about overlapping mechanisms is, yeah, it's really problematic. I think the problem of this framework is that all of these are not mutually exclusive, but they don't have to be either. But maybe I should make this clear, that just make it explicit that these are patterns that would be expected from theory, and then I should maybe refer to how they unfold in practice and why the logics, all of them are there, because in both cases I found all 3 types, and yeah, so maybe I should make this more explicit, but that's a good, fair point. Yeah, I have to be more clear on differentiating between discursive and social constructivist institutionalism. I can do that. And then, yeah, then your point about the network and experimentalist governance. Yeah, I should be also more explicit here, or maybe leave out the network governance concept, because I do think that the shadow of hierarchy plays a role, and I outlined this in my presentation earlier, that indeed political actors are really important, and that without political support, none of these cooperation networks would exist, and this is clearly an indicator for this shadow of hierarchy. So yeah, I will definitely revise this section, so thank you for this. And then for the other points, yeah, I can work on making my arguments more clear, and also contextualize Interact and insert a paragraph on what Interact is, and maybe also what you said about how higher education institutions are addressed by different EU policies. So I could also write 2 sentences about this. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know. I mean, for the rest of you now that you will have the floor. I mean, thank you, Alina. I mean, I'm glad that your comments were of some use to you. Also, I mean, if you want to intervene now, I would ask you to raise your hand. Right? I think you have a button right next to the chat window here in the right side. Below the participant list. So if you want to intervene, any of you, just raise your hand and I will just give you the floor so that we don't all talk at the same time. So yeah, does anybody have any comments or any questions? Yes, I don't know if Christian is raising his hand physically or not. Yes, you are? Okay, just go ahead. But next time, try to do it in the participant list so that I can have a look, and because I cannot see you everyone at the same time. Okay.
No, of course, but I did not. I don't know where it is. It disappeared. In any case, thank you, Alina. This is a very interesting paper, and you know, I really enjoyed. I did not know who would participate. I only saw it kind of in the last minute. And unfortunately, I didn't have time to go through the paper as such. But you know, based on your presentation, I can say it's very interesting. It could definitely contribute to this literature. And just to say a bit of you know, very briefly, I worked on regional policy myself and EU funds from a different perspective. But I also worked a bit at European Policies Research Center at Strathclyde University. Maybe you've heard of it, and they do a lot of evaluations of regional policy and also of cross-border cooperation programs. So having said that, you know, I really liked your framework, and I liked how you operationalized everything, just to, you know, highlight these things, and the findings are also very interesting. Probably very briefly, what could be improved, and what I found a bit unclear, is this kind of link between the second specific research question. To me, it's very good and interesting, but to me somehow, or you could have maybe to try to slightly link it a bit more to the theory, if you could, you know, if you consider it that to be the case. And because somehow I feel that this could help you examine your findings and also make you, empower you in order to kind of contribute to the literature, and you highlight what is your actual contribution to the specific literature. And the second point that I'm trying to make, maybe this you could think for a different paper, but there's always like a tension between, you know, using a deductive framework and then kind of the findings that come from your interviews. And that's a tension that I struggled with during my PhD as well, even now, when analyzing my interviews. So, you know, you could also let the data speak for itself and see, you could write a separate paper, more inductive on that. And yeah, so this is basically what I wanted to say. And if you don't know the European Policies Research Center, there are a few people there working on cross-border cooperation, and you could find maybe something interesting for you to have a look at, studies and public evaluations and stuff like that.
Okay, thank you. Just one small thing. I didn't mention it in my discussion, but I also noticed that a little bit more of dialogue between your theoretical framework and your discussion could be beneficial. You do have some, so it's okay. But I mean, the more you have, the better. I didn't mention, but I noticed it as well. I don't know if you want to respond to this comment, Alina.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much, Christian, for the comments and also for the hint to the European Policies Research Center, which probably I came across already, but yeah, there's so many things you come across. Yeah, so yeah, that's actually a good point to have this closer dialogue. Yeah, this is a constant struggle, obviously, and it might be a good idea to have a more inductive approach. I do this in my dissertation, which is going to be a monograph. So, and yeah, my empirical chapters there are indeed more inductive. I just thought that for a paper, it's a bit nicer to have this framework. Yeah, because I mean, as a qualitative researcher, you always have to struggle. So where's your mechanism? People would always want to have mechanisms. And then this is why I decided for having mechanisms. But yeah, I can have a stronger dialogue and also highlight maybe the contribution more explicitly, which I believe consists in really connecting firstly the two policy areas, which has rarely been done, and then also connecting more the levels, because very often researchers analyze the competences of the European Union in these fields and then what regional actors do, but rarely how these two come together, or if at all. So yeah, but I can highlight this more explicitly. Thank you.
Good. So now I think Marianna had raised her hand. So go ahead, Marianna.
Yeah. Hi. So hi, Alina. Nice to meet you virtually. And super interesting paper. And I'm also not very knowledgeable about your regional policy and cooperation in education. But I was wondering if, and you mentioned that in your conclusion, right, that there's scope for you to compare different areas within Europe. So I'm wondering whether there is like a qualitative difference between the type of cooperation, like border cooperation that you see in like Central Europe and some of the countries that have the stronger bonds, like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and like border regions that maybe are less integrated. So I'm thinking maybe, or maybe not. So I'm thinking maybe Eastern Europe, and whether there's like just as high a level of cross-border cooperation between, I don't know, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, or not, and then why that would be the case. And then the second super quick question, and again, maybe you mentioned it and I missed it, and in that case, I'm sorry. I'm wondering whether there's like a path dependency element in the extent to which like EU funds are allocated to universities and universities choose to cooperate with each other. So like, does like university reputation come into it, and or like pre-existing networks, and again, like if I missed that from your paper, I'm really sorry.
Thank you so much, Marianna. It's nice to meet you indeed, even though it's only virtually. So for the first comment, yeah, maybe I should put this into the section where I'm outlining what Interact is, and well, there is actually this focus on cross-border cooperation in border regions which are more integrated already. So this only makes sense, and but maybe I should highlight this. I did choose the cases also because of reasons of accessibility. So because I speak the languages, so that was one reason, but also there is indeed less cases of such cooperation. For example, there is some between France and Spain, and then there's also some at in the Danube region, but this is less cross-border, more bigger, and yeah, it's more abstract, and yeah, so. But I can refer to that because before I was selecting cases, I was seeing, okay, where actually does this happen, and there's this focus on Germany, so all the border regions of Germany, and yeah, but I can mention this too, and yeah, this connects to the path dependency element. I think it is somewhere in there, but too implicit. I mean, if you have institutional compliance, I mean, all the outcome column basically of the framework is sort of this path dependent element. So once you cooperate, you get money or what prestige, and then you want to cooperate more. But yeah, I can put this also in the discussion and then have this dialogue you mentioned before, the better dialogue between evidence and theory. So that's a very good point. Thank you.
Okay, does anyone else have any comments, any questions? Okay, it doesn't seem to be the case. So then, thank you very much, Alina. I hope this was useful for you. Virtual round of applause for you. And now I will just give the floor to Marianna, okay, who I'm also really happy. I mean, that you're here. Actually, I'm really happy. And yeah, let's hear your paper about the role of Italy in the negotiations with the European Union. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. So while I try and share my screen, I should probably end my master thesis research, and so it's slightly off what I'm researching at the moment, which is more negotiations in the area of foreign policy. But yes, hopefully it's interesting and relevant nonetheless. So again, in the interest of time constraints, I'll try and be as concise and clear at the same time as possible, but then obviously if there's questions or need for clarifications, happy to do that in the discussion. So the paper is titled When Domestic Constraints Weigh You Down, Italian Negotiation Success in Asylum and Economic Governance. And sorry. Okay, and I think, so this is going to be my structure, briefly go through the premise of the paper, the puzzle, the theoretical framework I developed to try and answer that puzzle, a brief word on the methodology I adopted, and then I'll dive right into the analysis of the 4 case studies that I chose, 2 in migration and asylum policy and 2 in fiscal and monetary policy, and then conclude with what I hope are the main contributions of the paper. So I think this quote really nicely introduces the puzzle at the heart of the paper, and it reads, Italy has undoubtedly contributed significantly to the process of Europeans that make up the formative phase of EU policymaking. So this is a quote from Federica Bindi, who, much like a lot of scholars of EU negotiations and decision-making, points out to this puzzling performance of Italy in EU negotiations. So this begs the question really, why is it that a country with Italy's political weight, economic resources, and administrative capacity has such a patchy record in terms of negotiation success, right? And I look at, as I mentioned, these Italy's negotiation of these 4 key EU policies between 2008 and 2016, and I find that the answer lies in a set of domestic factors that have largely been neglected by especially the rationalist school of negotiation theory. And these are systemic, structural, and individual domestic constraints, right? Which I operationalize respectively as government turnover, structural inter and intra-ministerial coordination, and then the individual skills and expertise of negotiators. But more broadly, I try and develop a sort of generalizable theoretical framework beyond just the Italian case, right, to account for the ways in which then the effect of these domestic constraints onto the negotiation outcomes is moderated by the preference constellation at the EU level, right? And again, just in a succinct table to show that for each of the 2 policy areas that I consider, I took an instance of negotiation success and an instance of negotiation failure, obviously from the perspective of the Italian government, right? So these 3 sets of domestic constraints that I mentioned, right, structural, systemic, and individual, I argue, then limit the set of bargaining strategies that a member state can use during negotiations, right? So, I mean, quite intuitively, if government is marred by constant political instability, as weak coordination capacity, and negotiators keep changing, right, with varying levels of expertise, that then will probably result in changes in policy stances, even within the same negotiation, right, which severely at the European Union level harms then a member state's credibility and reputation, right? And that means that you're less palatable as a coalition partner, and maybe you're less credible when you issue veto threats, right? So to capture the effect that these domestic constraints have on bargaining strategies during negotiations, I developed this concept of negotiation capacity, right? Which I define as the extent to which, given the country's domestic constraints, negotiators can make skillful use of all available bargaining strategies. But then, as I mentioned, right, looking just at the domestic level only tells part of the story. And then to really fully account for negotiation outcomes, we need to look at the preference constellation at the EU level, namely what the other member states' policy preferences are and what the EU institutions' policy preferences are. And this is, as Alina was mentioning, my mechanism, which summarizes all the different combinations between the member states' negotiation capacity and then the preference constellation at the EU level, and how that then results in different degrees of negotiation success. Very briefly, my sort of main hypothesis that I put forward is that the further a member state's ideal policy outcome is from the preference of the other member states and or the Commission, the lower the expected degree of negotiation success, even in most cases, if the member state has a strong negotiation capacity, right? And then conversely, weak negotiation capacity does not necessarily mean that you fail in the negotiations, provided that your member state enjoys support at the EU level. And we can get back to this in the discussion. You know, 2 words on the paper's methodology. So I process traced the negotiations, and my main source of data were 17 elite interviews that I conducted with Italian politicians, including 2 former prime ministers, Italian civil servants, and then EU officials. And all those people took part in the negotiations that I chose as case study. And then I triangulated the data with other sources of data, official documents, secondary sources, etc. So I'll go sort of relatively quickly through the 4 case studies, starting with Dublin 3, right, which was basically aimed at improving the human rights dimension of Dublin 2. And it was negotiated between 2008 and 2013. And this specific negotiation was characterized by a weak negotiation capacity by the Italian government. In those 5 years of negotiation, Italy went through 3 governments, was without a government for 3 months between January, I think, and March, April 2013. And as a consequence, even though at the technical level, negotiators remained the same, but then obviously ministers kept changing. And that resulted in very little investment in the policy debate by the Italian negotiators. And in terms of bargaining strategies, that meant little to no efforts to engage in coalition building with other member states that had very similar interests to Italy, like Spain, like Greece, Cyprus, Malta. And they didn't even try and form a blocking minority, right? And Commission officials I spoke to were very puzzled by this behavior. But at the EU level, if Italy was shy and reticent during the negotiation, that certainly wasn't the case for this trio of like-minded. So Sweden, the Netherlands, and the UK, who basically ended up shaping the negotiations, right? And then the Commission also played a problematic role, but we can maybe discuss that a little bit further, that basically eventually ended up harming Italy. The second, so the instance of negotiation success on asylum and migration policy is the EU Migration Partnership Framework, which in a nutshell basically was the EU policy to try and promote partnership with third countries to tackle migration issues. In this instance, we have a moderately strong negotiation capacity by Italy. So at the domestic level, there was extremely high levels of intra and interministerial coordination between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Interior, the President of the Council, and strong skills by the Italian negotiators. And all that resulted in a very timely and proactive policy proposal to the Commission, which the Commission found extremely to basically embrace their own preferences, and then they ended up pushing it with the other member states. And then in the end, this policy proposal by Italy, which was called the Migration Compact, basically ended up being incorporated in the Migration Partnership Framework. So great instance of negotiation success. Again, very briefly, this is the first instance of fiscal and monetary negotiation, and it's a case of negotiation success, right? What I focus on in my paper, especially with regards to the European Stability Mechanism, is the debates ahead of the Eurogroup meeting in June 2012, which had mainly, so the ESM had already been adopted, but the member states were still discussing, very much like they're discussing now, who was eligible for loans, whether there was conditionality attached to the loans or not. Italy had, I think, unparalleled, I think it's a negotiation where they had the strongest negotiation capacity. So in this case, government turnover was a good thing because the Berlusconi government was succeeded by the Monti government, which was made up by highly expert technocrats that promoted high levels of intra and interministerial coordinations. They were highly skilled, and that resulted in very effective bargaining strategies, including proactive coalition building with France and even in Spain to a certain extent, and also a very timely use of the veto threat by Prime Minister Monti and Rajoy during the Eurogroup discussions, which was extremely successful in securing final concessions. And at the EU level, while there was considerable oppositions, especially from the more fiscally conservative member states, the support of France was key here, and again, it resulted in a success for the Italians. Finally, before I head to my conclusions, the Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive was negotiated also between 2008 and 2016. And here, basically, we have a very moderately strong negotiation capacity by Italy, even though, again, the high government turnover in those years, right? I think by then there had been 4 or 5 governments during the negotiations, meant that if the technical level was made up by highly expert negotiators, then at the political level, right, the ministerial last stages of the negotiators kept turning over, and some think that they didn't manage to secure enough in terms of Italy's interests. But basically what really here determined the negotiation failure was the complete lack of support at the EU level, because the interest that Italy had on issues like bail-in and resolution of banks were just completely different from the majority of member states, and Italy found itself isolated. So to sum up, this table sort of concisely brings together the various combinations, of negotiation capacity and EU-level preference constellation for each of the 3 negotiations. So again, Dublin 3, weak negotiation capacity, isolated at the EU level, low degree of negotiation success. Migration Partnership Framework, you had relatively strong negotiation capacity. This is more nuanced in the paper if you've read it, but coupled with support at the EU level, high levels of negotiation success. For the BRRD, even with strong, capable negotiators, Italy was in the minority group, so low negotiation success. And finally, the ESM, you have extremely strong, capable negotiators. And then while in a difficult position, Italy did have some important support at the EU level, and it resulted in high success. So, yes, so I mean, I hope my paper was successful in showing that systemic, structural, and individual domestic factors are key to account for a member state's performance, and that then needs to be further integrated with the EU level preferences. And I'll just stop there because I know I'm way over time. So yeah, I'll give the floor back to Carlos.
Okay, Marianna, thank you very much. I'll give you my comments. Okay, I think it's a really interesting paper. It was, I mean, in terms of the writing style, I think there is a good job there, right? It's relatively easy to follow. The topic itself is fascinating. I mean, but having said this, I have, of course, some comments for you, which I advise you to take with a grain of salt, considering, again, that I'm no expert on this very specific field of negotiations, right? But I hope that you, at least some of these, you find them useful. Okay, so let's get started. I was wondering, when having a look at the abstract, right, and you're saying that domestic factors significantly influence a member state's performance in EU decision-making. I think that perhaps you could specify a bit further here, right? Because, of course, this conclusion is quite generalizable, but I don't know to what extent you could be more specific, right? And you have the case of Italy, you do have some very specific evidence, so I think if you do a bit of an effort in order to present some more specific conclusions, which of course are harder to be generalizable, I think this would be beneficial, right? When it comes to the external validity of your findings, I think you're quite ambitious in your proposal for the model when you're saying that, I mean, applicable for the logic of negotiations, right? I was wondering to what extent these negotiations on fiscal and migration policies are representative and even applicable to negotiations on other policy areas, right? To what extent is this this logic that works for Italy easily generalizable to other member states, as you're claiming, right? I was wondering, right? Because, for example, I don't know, I was wondering whether there are some hidden variables that you're not examining here in your analysis that may be playing a role, right? I like in this regard that in some cases you're presenting examples of other countries. I think Sweden, the UK, and Germany being successful. I think you should try to do that more, right? Because you don't do that all the time. And if you want to really generalize, you have to show that this is applicable also in other countries, at least, if not in other contexts as well, right? Also, for example, concerning hidden variables, the date when negotiations take place this could have some contextual factors. For example, the extent to which Euroscepticism was stronger or weaker in a country in question. For example, you have the case of Italy, which is quite clear that you have a big change, right? And this might have influenced perhaps the way that negotiations were conducted. Again, because of this aspiration of this being generalizable, you should at least acknowledge that there could be some limitations, right, to your argument, right? I'm not really familiar with negotiation theory, right? But in your introduction to the text, you say that individual systemic and structural domestic constraints have been largely neglected by the literature. But then in your short, and I will go on that literature review, you talk about authors who actually address it. So I was like, okay, so this has been neglected, but it has been addressed at the same time. I don't know. Like, in a way, I wanted to. I was a bit puzzled here, right? And also your research question, the answer that you give, this is at least my impression, that you talk mainly about systemic and structural domestic factors, but you don't say much about individual characteristics, which matter, why they matter, right? I mean, you talk about how different types of expertise can contribute to negotiations, but that's not necessarily the same, right, as individual characteristics, right, of negotiators. So I was like, maybe you could expand a bit here, because you're claiming that you talk about them, right? Also, I think staying with the literature review section, I think you should develop it much more, right? Because I think you have to convince your reader that you know the state of the art, right? And clarifying more precisely what your contribution may be, right? You have a bit of Putnam and rationalist theory about negotiation theory, right? But I think there is much more that you can talk about, and I would advise you to expand it. But again, of course, this is your decision. Feel free to totally ignore me because again, I'm no expert, so it might not make sense at all. Also, you talk about interministerial and intraministerial coordination being relevant. I was wondering, why are they relevant? Because you don't really, I mean, beyond what your interviewees told you, but why does it matter, right? What does the literature say? Are there any other examples than Italy that have been analyzed talking about this, right? Maybe not directly, but some indirect analysis about this could have been done in the past, right? In other maybe case studies, which you could address. Since I'm no expert, I cannot directly refer you to these works, but I was missing this, right? And also the way that you're presenting your theory, I was wondering whether you could restructure some sections, right? Because you talk a little bit about hard and soft bargaining techniques, then you present how domestic factors affect the ability of how domestic factors affect the ability of actors to carry out such hard or soft bargaining techniques. And I don't know, like maybe it could be a little more systematic, like in a way, like, okay, this is my theory, this is the literature review, right? And then presenting your own contribution and then going in the analysis and then everything there. It's a bit unstructured in this way, right? Even if you're talking about hard and soft bargaining techniques, you bring them up in the kind of theoretical analysis, but then you sort of forget about them in the empirical analysis of the case study, and then you bring them up again in the final section. So I don't know, like there could be a bit more systematization in the analysis, in my opinion. Yeah, but how does the choice of negotiation strategy impact on the success of negotiations? Does it? I mean, if at all? Because I mean, you talk about this, but then I was like, why? I was like waiting for more, right? Okay, then I think that in your presentation you did a much, at least in the way that they came across to me when I was reading your paper. You were more clear when you're talking about the factors that determine a higher and a lower negotiation capacity. Since you have it in your presentation, I think you could be more clear in your paper, right? In the way that you talk about this. Again, in order to make your reader really follow what you're talking about and the points that you're making and buy them, right? Okay, then you talk about EU level variables, right? And then you present EU institutions, primarily the Commission, as one of these variables, right? But I was wondering, is this the Commission just a variable by itself, or perhaps its behavior, its preferences? I don't know, because it might not be the same, or the relationship between the Commission and the country in question or any other body, right? But just Commission as a variable, I was like, maybe you want to specify a bit more what you mean by this being something that influences the process that you're talking about. Okay. Okay, no, I'm not done, sorry. So talking about the very specific case studies that you're talking about, Dublin 3, right? Again, I like that you refer to Sweden, Germany, and UK as successful negotiators. But I mean, I was wondering whether you could spell out more as to why they succeeded, right? Is it only because they just had a like-minded position and occupied floor time, or is there something else? And here, the more, and this is something that it was talked about in Alina's presentation, but also applies to your paper. The more you dialogue with your theoretical framework in the analysis of your case studies, the better. And especially when you're talking about the role of the EU institutions, I'm missing a bit more dialogue. How does it relate to your theoretical model, right? Besides the fact that EU institutions matter in negotiations, which I guess, I mean, you could say more things that they just matter, right? And how and why, and you know. Then you go on the migration partnership framework, and you say that it's kind of counterintuitive, right? That it's been a success, right? But problematic decisions were made. But you're very descriptive, but I think you can be a bit more analytical, right? And again, more dialogue with your theoretical framework. Why this was a success, even if there were problematic decisions? What is the weight of the different variables that you're talking about? What does it tell us about your model? because this is interesting, right? To what extent is this an outlier? Or there are other contextual factors that were coming into play, right? Perhaps in these particular negotiations, right? And even, well, yeah, yeah, that would be it in this case. And then the ESM, maybe it came to me that actually the characteristics of Monty as an individual respected and embedded in the institutions matter a lot here, right? And I don't know to what extent this was the case. And here you maybe could talk about these individual characteristics of negotiators in a way. I don't know, that could give you like some realm for talking about this. Then when you talk about the bank recovery, right, you say that the turnover, the high ministry's turnover, was detrimental for the negotiations. But I was wondering to what extent this factor was also present in the other 4 negotiations. To what extent is it not the case, right? Maybe it's easier for the reader to follow your argument if you have a table with these 4 case studies and the factors that you're talking about being present, not being present, right? Then you talk about the US president giving support and that's being like really important in the negotiations, right? And this is an external power. But I was wondering how this fits into your model, because this is a factor that you don't really talk about in your theoretical discussion, but then you say that this is actually very important. So again, more systematization, right? I mean, I was missing this. Then the case selection, right? I was wondering, why did you choose these 2 sectors, fiscal policy and migration policy? Do you have any particular reasons? I assume that, I mean, here you kind of selected on the dependent variable, right? 2 negotiation successes and 2 negotiation failures. I don't know if you will get criticism in this regard because you are having a why question, but just be careful, like, because you might get it again. And then you're talking about negotiation success and negotiation failure. Why is a negotiation a success? Why is it a failure? What do you mean? Could you be more explicit on how you measure success, how you measure failure, right? And then another thing that I already mentioned with Alina, I think, in your conclusion, you basically are bringing up new information. And this is even more clear in your case than in Alina's, right? You're talking about informality, you're talking about things that you barely discussed before, right? And you're adding new information that is kind of relevant for your conclusion. So maybe this would better fit in a discussion section, right? And then in your conclusions, you would kind of recap whatever is important for the answer to your research question, right? At least this is how I see it. And then a couple of minor things. I would avoid using the pronoun I, just in general. You use it just once. You say, I would formulate the concept of this paper, whatever. I mean, I would do it. Some papers, you can see it, especially in political theory. I've seen it more and more, but I would avoid it. And another thing, you mentioned some acronyms here, Northern European member states, Southern European member states. I assume that you mean that, right? Because you don't spell them out. You don't really talk about what the acronyms mean the first time you use them. So I think you should do that, because of the reader should not guess what you mean, right? And well, that would be basically it. I know I can be I have a lot of stuff to say, and I hope it was helpful for you. So feel free to reply to whatever I said.
So I guess the first caveat to a lot of your comments, which are absolutely great, and thanks for reading the paper in such detail, is the word limit of most journal submissions. So so in a lot of the comments that you made to my original MPhil thesis, all these things were discussed at length. So the literature review section was way longer, as well as just the theory section in general. So I think here is an exercise of trying to be, again, fit the findings in one paper, while at the same time, as you were saying, right, being systematic and being clear. And there might be more work that I need to do there, absolutely. Right, so the external validity of the model, I guess that ties into your question about the literature. I know it is externally valid to the extent that the factors, I mean, I'm not, and again, I probably should stress that more, but again, space constraints, right? I'm not the first one to come up with these ideas of structural, systemic, and individual domestic constraints. And those are insights that were brought into the debate by the European integration literature more than by the negotiation theory literature. In the sense that people that were trying to explain, for instance, why are some member states better at implementing EU decisions than others, right? And they looked at the administrative capacity, the political system of the member states, right? The individual people in power. So I brought that in, and so I know that, for instance, like it's a valid. For instance, I know that also speaking with the people I interviewed, that in Germany, this intra-ministerial problem, because it's a federal system and because most especially it's a lot of coalition governments, then you might have a minister from a party on one issue and then a minister from another party, and then they need to cooperate for that policy negotiation. But cooperation isn't always that easy, right? And then maybe there's a union minister from the person who's like SPD, who's like CDU, and then, right, and then, but I absolutely take your point that then if you do make a claim about external validity, you need to back it up, right? I don't want to, like, I'll try and reply to the, like, oh, and obviously, again, maybe that's not clear in my literature review, but what I tried to say is that especially the rationalist school of negotiation theory has focused on what they call domestic constraints, right? But they rather talk about like referenda requirement and parliamentary mandate. And that's the like famous Schelling conjecture and like the paradox of weakness. Like member states, right, going to the EU and saying, oh no, my parliament will never accept this. My hands are tied. And that like looks like weakness when it's actually negotiators using domestic context to gain leverage during negotiations. But not in the, especially again, the rationalist literature, people don't look at like, are they changing a government a year? Or, you know, is the administrative coordination, does that matter? And that matters. And I tried to highlight it in the theory section, but again, maybe it wasn't clear, that it just, how quick and how efficient you are in coordinating on like a weekly basis matters for how then you go into your working group meetings, your co-repair meetings, your whatever meetings, and how, you know, consistent you are in holding the same position. And one thing, especially the Italian negotiators are famous for, is that because they're often bad at coordinating domestically, then they arrive 1 week with one position and the week after with another position, or they clarify their position, you know, the day before. And that disincentivizes a lot of other member states from saying, you know, let's seek Italy as partner for, you know, a coalition. Which is partly why the UK, Sweden, Germany, the Netherlands, they're really good in coalition building at the EU level, because they stick to their position throughout the negotiation. They meet all the time in informal, formal meetings. So it's just a very different, whereas, as I say, I think in the conclusion, Southern European member states are way less good at doing this. Yes, the point about soft and hard bargaining techniques is very well taken, and I'm thinking of maybe just even scrapping this, just because I don't know that it is central to then the empirical discussion, to just scrap this distinction and just say, member states, these are the bargaining strategies that member states can avail themselves of, right? The extent to which the bargaining strategies that member states use and the extent to which they're impactful for the negotiation is exactly what I tried to show, for instance, like in my discussion of Dublin 3, right? When I say Italy did not engage in any coalition building. Look at the member states who did, and I mean, again, because of lack of space, I couldn't say this, but if you look at the proceedings and the various drafts of Dublin 3, you can see that Sweden, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands put amendments at like every article, every time, whereas Italy is like 2-3 comments, right? And you can really see like, you know, the different levels of engagement. Similarly, like how Monti, like I think he met almost every week with France and Germany and Spain to try and sort out ESM conditionality issues, right? So that is really, and he really built a relationship with Hollande. The point about the US president as well, you know, if it's not relevant, I should leave that out. I guess one last thing I'll reply to, because then otherwise I'm aware of time. The case selection. Again, that was a big chunk in my thesis, but then again had to downsize it. I tried to choose negotiations to hold a certain type of things constant by design, like issue characteristics. So I chose two both like politicized and highly salient policy areas, so that people couldn't tell, oh, but here Italy was more successful because the issue was just more important to the country, and that's why, right? But I also take your point on selecting an variable, and I guess I'll just have to like go on a limb there. And absolutely, I was already thinking of adding at least a footnote on how I define negotiation success, because that's absolutely well taken. So yeah, but thanks a lot for the comments.